The courtroom is a cathedral of mahogany and silence. Not the comfortable silence of an empty church, but the suffocating silence of a room holding its breath. It is the summer of 1858, and the air hangs thick with humidity and anticipation. The wallpaper, a dull gold with fading floral patterns, seems to absorb sound rather than reflect it. Even the dust motes floating through the high windows move with the lethargy of the heat. Constance Whitmore sits in the front row, her posture impeccable. Her back does not touch the chair. Her hands rest folded in her lap, gloved in pale gray kid leather, as pristine as they were the moment she entered this room. She is 42 years old, though her bearing suggests a woman who has never been young only, ever composed. Her widow's weeds are new, the black bombazine still holding the sharp crease of the tailor's iron. It is only 6 days since her husband's funeral, but already, as she sits here, she knows what is coming. She can feel it in the way the attorney, Mr. Douglas Hartwell, cannot meet her eyes. She has been married for 23 years. She knows the geometry of shame. She has catalogued its angles in the faces of men who have something to tell her that she will not want to hear. Hartwell clears his throat. He is 71 years old, and he has been preparing wills for the planter aristocracy since before Constance was born. His hands shake slightly as he adjusts his spectacles. It is not from age. It is from something else, something close to fear. The document before him on the desk is only 4 pages. It should not take long. The last will and testament of Jonathan Whitmore, he reads, his voice moving through the formalities, like a man reciting a prayer he no longer believes. Being of sound mind, I do hereby ... Constance's chin tilts up slightly. It is a gesture, so small that only someone who has spent decades observing her would notice. But it is there, the first sign of acknowledgement. Of waiting, Hartwell moves through the standard language. The removal of debts, the appointment of executors, the bequest of certain items of sentimental value, a pair of silver candlesticks to his brother in Charleston, his pocket watch to his eldest nephew, the mahogany desk from his study, and then a pause. Hartwell's finger moves down the page, and his lips seem to struggle with the words. The sum of $5,000 to my devoted friend Mr. Henry Castlewell, in recognition of his faithful service. $5,000. This is a not insignificant sum. But this is not the shock. Constance could absorb this. She breathes through it. To my wife, Constance Eleanor Whitmore, Hartwell continues, and here his voice drops almost imperceptibly. I do bequeath my earnest wishes for her continued health and prosperity. The room seems to tilt. Not a house, not land, not securities or bonds, or the deed to the cotton warehouse in Savannah. Not even the jewelry, her jewelry, the pieces her own mother had given her on her wedding day. No household allowance, no widow's portion, no provision whatsoever except wishes. Wishes and nothing else. Hartwell's reading voice has become mechanical, pressing forward through his own discomfort. Whereas the remainder of my estate, including all real property, all holdings in the Whitmore plantation, all monies held in trust, all securities and investments, and all personal effects not herein specifically bequeathed, I do bequeath in full and entirety to Rachel Carmichael. Rachel Carmichael. The name sits in the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples will break everything. Constance's fan, she is holding it. She realizes dimly begins to shake in her hand. She can feel the tremor now, moving up through her wrist into her forearm. It is as though she has become a tuning fork, resonating with a frequency only she can hear. Her fingers, which moments before were so carefully controlled, so perfectly arranged, begin to work against the wooden frame of the fan. Rachel Carmichael, she hears herself say, or perhaps she does not say it aloud. Perhaps the words exist, only in her mind, and she is the one hearing them, echoing back to herself in the narrow chamber of her skull. She knows who Rachel Carmichael is. Everyone knows who Rachel Carmichael is. Or, more precisely, everyone knows what Rachel Carmichael is. Was. Technically is, unless the legal machinery of Savannah has already moved to strip her of personhood. She was an enslaved woman in her husband's household. She was born on the Whitmore plantation some 28 years ago, the daughter of an enslaved mother and a father whose identity no white person in Georgia has ever bothered to record. She worked in the house. She was present at dinner, invisible behind the serving dishes. She was there in the mornings when Constance took her tea. She was everywhere and nowhere, the way that these women are not human enough to be visible, not insignificant enough to ignore, and her husband has left her everything to this woman. The fan gives way. The wood, which has been solid, which has withstood 1,000 dinners and 1,000 social gatherings without yielding splinters with a crack that is small but audible. A single piece, sharp as a fingernail, cuts into the soft skin of her palm. She looks down at it with a kind of remote fascination. Blood blooms against the pale gray of her glove. Hartwell has stopped reading. The courtroom is absolutely still. There is a gentleman sitting behind Constance. She became aware of him only by the sudden absence of his breathing, as though all the air in the room has been drawn into her own lungs and will not be released. Surely, Constance says, and her voice is crystalline, perfectly modulated, the voice of a woman who has been trained since girlhood to speak over the noise of a drawing room. You have misread. Surely you have misread. It is not a question. Hartwell's face has gone the color of wet newspaper. I am afraid not, Mrs. Whitmore. The document is quite clear. Your husband's signature is here, witnessed and notarized. He composed this will himself, in fact, 3 months ago, with the full power of his faculties intact. 3 months ago. 3 months ago, Jonathan had been well. 3 months ago, he had taken his morning ride across the plantation without complaint. 3 months ago, he had not yet begun to complain of the pains in his chest, the difficulties with breathing, the sense that something inside him was beginning to rot from the inside outward. 3 months ago, Constance had still believed that her life meant something. I see, she says. The blood has now soaked through to the other side of her glove. She does not look at it again. And what am I to do, Mr. Hartwell? Am I to understand that I am to be, what is the word? Disinherited? Cast out? Hartwell touches his spectacles. Again, a nervous habit. The will provides for a widow's portion, Mrs. Whitmore. Under Georgia law, even if your husband's will did not include such provision, you would be entitled to 1/3 of his estate. However, your husband has attempted to circumvent this provision by placing his estate into a trust specifically for Miss Carmichael. It is ... unconventional. There may be legal grounds to challenge it, but I confess I have never encountered anything quite like it before. The room is very hot. Constance can feel perspiration beginning to gather at the base of her skull, at the small hollow at the back of her neck, where her hair is pinned up in its perfect arrangement. The sensation is repulsive to her. Sweat is what servants produce. Sweat is what indicates a loss of control. She rises. The gesture is automatic, something her body has learned to do when a conversation has terminated to her dissatisfaction. Then I believe we are finished here, Mr. Hartwell. I shall contact you regarding the challenge to this document. I suspect my husband's mind was not as sound as we have been led to believe. She turns to leave. Behind her, she can hear Hartwell clearing his throat again, searching for words, settling on none. It is only as her hand touches the wooden door, frame its wood warm from the sun coming through the window, that another thought arrives in her mind, crystalline and cold. She does not know where she will go. She does not know where she will sleep tonight. She does not have a house. She does not have money. She does not have anything except for the black dress she is wearing and the broken fan in her bleeding hand. The realization does not break her. Stride. She opens the door and walks through it with the same measured pace she has maintained since entering the courtroom. Behind her, the room releases its held breath like a sigh. The illusion of their life before the crash 10 years earlier. The Whitmore plantation house sits on a rise of red Georgia clay like a proclamation written in brick and white columns. It is a handsome structure, not the oldest in the county, not the grandest, but well-maintained, well-appointed, and completely, utterly still, even on a spring morning when the oaks are budding and the air carries the faint sweetness of magnolia blossoms. Something about the house suggests a painting, rather than a living space. It is as though the Whitmores have constructed their home not as a place to inhabit, but as a stage set for a play about prosperity. The columns are painted an eye-watering white. The brick is laid with mathematical precision. The gardens are arranged in the European style, all symmetry and control, with not a single weed permitted to suggest that anything in nature might grow outside prescribed bounds. Jonathan Whitmore stands on the wraparound porch, surveying this domain. He is 53 years old, lean and straight-backed, the kind of man who has spent most of his life on horseback. His face is weathered by the Georgia sun to the color of old brick, and his eyes gray-green, with the pale, unblinking stare of someone who has never doubted his place in the world, move across the landscape with the satisfaction of a man. Counting his possessions, the plantation stretches out before him for more than 1,000 acres. The cotton fields are green with early growth. The orchards show the promise of fruit. The slave quarters form neat rows in the distance, already humming with morning work. Everything, by Jonathan's estimation, is as it should be. Constance emerges from the house behind him. She is 32 years old at this moment in time. Though she seems to belong to no particular age, she might be 20, or 40, or ageless, in the way that very beautiful women sometimes are when beauty has been trained into them from childhood like accent. She wears a pale blue dress, silk, with lace at the cuffs. Her hair is arranged in the elaborate style of the day, a construction of braids and curls that must take her maid at least an hour to perfect each morning. She is carrying her embroidery. The Hendersons are coming for dinner this evening, she says, settling herself into a wicker chair near her husband. Not next to him, but near him, the exact distance that suggests companionship without intimacy, partnership without affection. I know, Jonathan responds. He does not look at his wife. He continues to gaze out at the fields. The prime rib, Constance continues. She has threaded a needle with crimson silk, and she begins to pull it through a pattern of flowers already sketched onto a piece of linen. And fresh asparagus. Cook found early asparagus at the market in town. And I've asked that the table be set with the Limoges china, the blue set. I thought it would complement the table linens. Jonathan grunts. It is the sound of a man who has heard many words and has decided that responding with actual language would be an unnecessary expenditure of energy. Margaret Henderson mentioned at the last gathering that she had begun wearing her mother's pearls. Constance says, and there is something in her voice, the thinnest wire of something sharp, something not quite controlled. It made me wonder if I should excavate mother's pearls as well. They've been in the chest upstairs for so long. There is a long silence. Jonathan finally turns his head. He looks at his wife, and his expression is opaque, the face of a man who has learned to show nothing, because showing something might grant her a foothold from which to make demands. Do as you wish, he says. The pearls are yours. And then he returns to his examination of the fields, dismissing her. From inside the house, there is the sound of activity. Servants moving through the halls, their footsteps muffled by the good. Carpets, water being drawn for the washing, food being prepared in the kitchen house. The whole machinery of a well-run plantation rotating on its axis, oiled by habit, powered by the uncomplicated certainty that this is how things are meant to be. This is how they will always be. This is the natural order of the world. Rachel is in the kitchen house when Constance passes through en route to review the evening's menu. Rachel is 23 years old, still young enough to move without the protective wariness of age, still old enough to have learned the art of making herself small in spaces not her own. She stands over a table, pressing out dough for bread, her hands working with the kind of unconscious competence that comes from having performed the same task 10,000 times before. She does not look up when the mistress of the house enters. Constance passes near her, close enough that Rachel could have touched her dress with one flourished hand, had she been mad enough to do so. But Rachel does not move. She keeps her eyes on her work. She keeps her breathing slow and regular. She makes herself into a piece of furniture, a tool, an extension of the labor being performed. This is what survival looks like in the Whitmore household. It looks like absence. It looks like becoming so thoroughly invisible that your continued existence becomes a question no one bothers to ask. But Rachel's eyes are paying attention. Her mind, behind the perfect stillness of her face, is a sharp and calculating thing. She has learned every inflection of Constance's voice. She knows when the mistress is satisfied and when she is not. She knows when the tension between Mr. Whitmore and Mrs. Whitmore has drawn so tight that it might snap at any moment, and when it has settled into the comfortable weight of indifference. She watches as Constance moves through the kitchen, pointing at things, giving instructions that the older cook, a woman named Miriam, who has been in the household for 30 years, acknowledges with nods and murmurs of assent. There is a performance happening here. Rachel has come to understand that almost everything in the Whitmore household is a performance, the perfection of the gardens, the immaculateness of the china, the beauty and compliance of the wife. All of it is theater, a show put on for an audience of one. Society itself, that invisible jury that judges everything a person does, everything they own, everything they are. And beneath it, underneath all of this perfect arrangement and perfect order, there is something else, something that lives in the spaces between words. In the way Jonathan watches the young women of the household when he thinks no one is looking, in the way Constance's jaw tightens at the dinner table, in the careful way that everyone who serves in this house has learned to move, to breathe, to exist without drawing too much attention, because attention in this household is a dangerous thing. That evening, the Hendersons arrive in a carriage pulled by matched bays. They are dressed in their finest, and they smell of the road dust, and the particular anxiety of people trying to impress their hosts. Margaret Henderson, thin, nervous, perpetually concerned that her china is not quite as fine as everyone else's china sweeps, into the parlor with her husband in tow. The dinner is everything Constance promised. The prime rib is perfectly cooked. The asparagus is tender. The wine flows. The conversation follows the prescribed routes: comments on the weather, observations about local politics, speculation about a scandal involving a merchant's daughter and a man of questionable repute. Everything is civilized. Everything is correct. Jonathan is charming. It is a quality he turns on and off like a lamp. When he wishes to be charming, he is extraordinarily so. His smile reaches his eyes. His attention on his guests is complete. He laughs at jokes in that way of men who are confident enough to find something funny. Margaret Henderson, who had arrived nervous, begins to relax. She leans in when Jonathan speaks. She laughs a little too loudly at his observations. Constance watches this performance with the eye of an old hand. She knows what her husband is doing, and she has learned not to mind. She has learned, in fact, but the less she minds, the more pleasant her life becomes. If Jonathan is charming to Margaret Henderson, then Margaret Henderson will leave this house convinced that the Whitmores are sophisticated, brilliant, a couple worth emulating. And that reputation will extend into the wider world, and the Whitmores will be more invited to dinners, more sought after at gatherings, more central to the social machinery that matters to people like Jonathan and Constance. Rachel is serving the meal. She brings the dishes in and sets them down at specific points around the table. She removes the empty plates. She pours the wine with a steadiness of hand that suggests the task is nothing to her, though she has been trained since childhood to execute these small movements with precision. And while she does this, she watches Dot. She watches Jonathan's hand how it brushes against Margaret Henderson's arm when he gestures. It is a small thing, perhaps accidental, but it is also perhaps not accidental. Rachel has learned to see the difference. She does not know, of course, that this day is coming. She does not know that in 10 years, the master will draw up a will that will dismantle everything his wife has worked to construct. She does not know that she will be the instrument of that destruction. All she knows is that she is standing in a dining room full of dying light, and for the first time in her life, she is beginning to understand that her existence, her life, her future, her very self belongs to no one but her. And in that understanding, like a seed pushed into dark soil, something begins to grow. The psychological tension in the house, the seasons change. The cotton grows. The machinery of the plantation rotates with the mindless efficiency of something that has learned to perpetuate itself without human intervention. And within the house, on the rise of red clay, something begins to shift. It is not visible to anyone outside. The gardens remain perfect. The china remains immaculate. The silver continues to shine. But inside, the air has taken on a quality of waiting, of holding breath, of listening for something that has not yet happened, but is certain to come. Constance knows. This is the first thing to understand. She knows, and she does not know, in the way that women in her position have learned to know without acknowledging what they know. It is a kind of compartmentalization so complete that it approaches an art form. She can stand in the parlor in the afternoon and discuss the weather with a visiting lady, and in that moment she is entirely present, entirely sincere, entirely unaware that anything is wrong. And then, at night, in her bedroom, with the door locked and the curtains drawn, she understands everything. The evidence, when she allows herself to look for it, is everywhere. It is written in the way Jonathan no longer asks her to come to his bed. It is written in the scratches on his cheek that he claims came from riding, but that form a pattern too geometric, too deliberate, to be accidental. It is written in the time he spends in the study with the door closed, and in the way that Rachel's footsteps always seem to pass by that door, and in the long stretches of silence that follow those footsteps. Constance has installed a small mirror in the hallway. It is positioned so that she can see, from her sitting room, who comes and goes from the study when she pretends to be reading. She does not look at it often, but when she does, and she does every evening, the way a person might check a wound to see if it has begun to fester, she sees Rachel, always Rachel, going in with a candle, coming out with an empty tray. Sometimes an hour passes, sometimes more. There is no physical evidence. There is no catch of fabric, no note, no letter left carelessly on a desk. This is what makes it worse. The absence of proof makes the certainty more unbearable, because she cannot point to it and make someone else see. She cannot walk into the parlor and announce what she knows to be true, because the moment she does, she becomes a woman who has been betrayed, and being betrayed is a kind of social death in Georgia. She takes to walking the halls at night. Ostensibly, she is checking on the household, making sure the servants have done their work. But really, She is listening. She is standing outside the study door, her ear pressed against the wood, straining to hear voices that never come. Jonathan does not speak to Rachel when they are together. This is somehow worse than if he did. One night in late September, when the heat has turned syrupy and the crickets have begun their endless, mechanical song, Constance hears something that breaks her. It is not a voice. It is not words. It is the sound of Jonathan laughing. Not the controlled, performative laugh he produces for dinner guests. Not the dismissive grunt of amusement, but a real laugh, the laugh of a man who is experiencing genuine pleasure, genuine joy. She has not heard him make that sound in more than 10 years. She stands in the hallway for a very long time after the laugh stops. Her hands are shaking. Her breath is coming in small, shallow pulls. When she finally returns to her bedroom, she sits on the edge of her bed and begins to cry. But the tears do not come from sadness. They come from rage. They come from the knowledge that somewhere in this house, in a room she is not permitted to enter, her husband is experiencing a kind of happiness that he has never shared with her. The town notices, of course. The town always notices. But it notices in the way that small southern towns have learned to notice, which is to say, it sees everything and says nothing directly. Instead, the information circulates in whispers. It travels from the seamstress to the merchant's wife to the wife of the judge. It gets softer as it travels, more deniable, more easily dismissed. But it is there Margaret Henderson, the same Margaret Henderson from the dinner party, is the first to broach it with Constance. She does it on a Tuesday afternoon, during a social call, with a cup of tea cooling on a saucer between them. "I have heard," Margaret says, and her voice carries that particular tone of concern that masks something closer to hunger, "that your household has been blessed with a new, I suppose companion is the word ... for Rachel. I understand she has been given quite a bit of responsibility about the house." Constance's teacup does not waver. Her voice does not change. Rachel has always been a reliable servant. "I have no complaints about her work." "Of course not," Margaret says quickly. "I only meant that some people have remarked that she seems to have taken on more ... visible duties. Certain tasks that one might normally expect the mistress of the house to oversee." The subtext is clear. Rachel is being promoted. Rachel is being seen. Rachel is being treated as something other than a servant, and this is noticed, and this is wrong. "I am not certain I understand your meaning," Constance says, still perfectly composed. Servants take on the duties assigned to them. Rachel is no exception. "No, of course," Margaret says, and she sets down her cup with a little clink of porcelain against saucer. "It is only that one does hear remarks about your husband's attention to the household management, about how he takes such a personal interest in certain matters." This is as close as Margaret can come to saying what everyone is thinking. And Constance, in that moment, makes a decision. She will acknowledge nothing. She will confirm nothing. She will present to the world the image of a woman whose household is perfectly managed, perfectly controlled, perfectly appropriate. And she will do this because the alternative, admitting that her husband is engaged in an affair with an enslaved woman in her own house, would be to admit that she is not in control. And a woman who is not in control is a woman who might as well be dead. "I am grateful for your concern," Constance says, and she smiles, and the smile does not reach her eyes. "But I assure you, everything in the Whitmore household is exactly as it should be." Margaret leaves shortly after, unsatisfied, but unable to push further without becoming visibly cruel. And Constance sits in the parlor for a long time after she is gone, listening to the sound of the house settling around her, understanding with perfect clarity that everyone knows, and that everyone will pretend they do not know, and that this pretense is its own kind of torture, Jonathan's relationship with Rachel cannot be called a romance. This is important to understand. It is not the story of a man who has fallen in love with a woman beneath his station and chosen her over his wife. It is something more complicated and more sinister than that. It is the story of a man who has power and the realization, late in life, that power without the possibility of resistance is empty. Rachel cannot refuse him. Rachel cannot argue with him. Rachel cannot demand anything of him. Rachel exists in a state of absolute availability. And for a man like Jonathan, this is more intoxicating than any genuine love could be. He brings her things. Small things. A ribbon for her hair, imported from Charleston. A pair of slippers, fine leather, worn only indoors. A book wrapped in cloth, which she is forbidden to read while anyone else is in the house. These are not the gestures of a man proving his affection. These are the gestures of a man proving his ownership. He is not giving her things. He is simply redistributing his possessions, making certain that everyone knows that she belongs to him more completely than anyone else in the household belongs to him. Rachel does not smile when he gives her these things. She receives them with a kind of blank gratitude, the way she might receive an order to clean a room. But something else is happening in her mind, something that Jonathan, in his blindness, does not see. She has begun to understand that. She has become essential to him in a way that Constance never was. She has become the thing that makes him feel alive. And if she is the thing that makes him feel alive, then she has a kind of power. It is not a power she can exercise openly. It is not a power that the law or society recognizes. But it is there, growing like a plant in dark soil, fed by his desperation and his hunger and his need to feel, at the end of his life, that he has meant something to someone. And in that understanding, Rachel begins to think about what might happen if she were not available to him anymore. She begins to think about what might happen if she were to disappear. She begins to think about what might happen if he were to understand, finally, what it means to want something that is being withheld from him. By 1858, 5 years into this strange entanglement, Jonathan has aged significantly. He still maintains the posture of a younger man, still rides every morning, still insists on his authority over every aspect of the plantation. But there is something about him that has become thin, worn, as though the anxiety of his life is consuming him from the inside outward. He has taken to spending his afternoons in the study, doors closed, working on documents that he will not discuss with anyone. Constance, in her observations, has noticed him burning papers in the fireplace. She has noticed him writing and rewriting the same passages over and over. She has noticed, with something approaching grim satisfaction, that he seems to be afraid. Afraid of what? She does not yet know. But the sudden illness and the locked room, it begins on a Tuesday. This is the detail that the doctor will remember, the detail that will be repeated in the whispered conversations at the market and the hushed debates in parlors across Savannah. It began on a Tuesday, and by Friday he was dead. There had been no warning, no creeping illness, no gradual decline that allowed time for preparation or prayer. Just a sudden collapsing inward, as though the mechanism that had been holding Jonathan Whitmore together had, all at once, decided to stop. He complains of pain in his chest during breakfast. Nothing unusual about this. Jonathan has been complaining about pain for months now, the low-grade bodily protests of a man in his 60s who has spent his life on horseback and in the sun. But this pain is different. It is sharp, radiating down his left arm, making his breath catch. Constance, watching from across the table, notes the way his hand comes up to his chest, the way his face goes pale. She says nothing. She returns her attention to her eggs. "I believe I will rest this morning," Jonathan says. His voice is strained. I will take my midday meal in my room. By afternoon, it is worse. Much worse. His valet brings word that he is burning with fever, that he has asked for the blinds to be drawn and the room to be kept absolutely quiet. The doctor is sent for. Dr. Paulson is 75 years old and has delivered half the babies in Savannah County, including Jonathan himself. He is accustomed to the minor complaints of plantation owners' gout, indigestion, the general deterioration of men who have lived too well and thought too little about consequences. But when he enters Jonathan's bedroom, Dr. Paulson understands that something serious is occurring. Jonathan lies in bed, propped up on pillows, his breathing labored and shallow. His skin has taken on a grayish quality, the color of a man who is not getting enough air. His eyes move restlessly beneath closed lids. He is speaking sometimes, words that are not coherent, fragments of sentences that belong to no one and nothing. The documents, he says at one point. The documents must be. They must be finished. Rest now, Dr. Paulson says, and he places his hand on Jonathan's forehead. The fever is extreme. You are unwell. You need rest and quiet. Not rest, Jonathan insists, and he grabs at the doctor's sleeve with surprising strength. Not rest. Until it is done. Dr. Paulson bleeds him. This is what doctors do in 1858. And though the practice is increasingly questioned among the more modern medical practitioners, it remains the default response to fever and apparent heart distress. He bleeds him, and he administers laudanum to help him sleep, and he tells Constance that her husband must have complete rest and isolation. No visitors, no disturbances. Quiet and calm are the only medicines that will serve him now. Constance accepts these instructions with her usual composure. She arranges for clean linens to be brought to the bedroom. She ensures that water is heated and available. She stands in the doorway of the sick room, looking at her husband with an expression that might be concern and might be something else entirely, something too complex to name. I will sit with him, she says to the servants who are hovering in the hallway. The doctor said rest, Miriam says carefully. Miriam, who has been in the household for longer than anyone else, who has seen things that she pretends not to see, who understands, better than anyone, the strange currents that flow through the Whitmore house. I am his wife, Constance says. I will sit with him. But by evening, Jonathan has asked her to leave. Not in a direct way. He does not have the strength for directness, but through a series of small gestures. He asks for the room to be darker. He asks for less noise. He asks finally for Rachel. Constance repeats. She is standing at the bedside, her hands folded in front of her, her face perfectly still. Rachel is a servant, Jonathan. You have a wife. Rachel, he says again, more insistently, as though the name itself is something he must cling to, something that will keep him afloat in the dark water he is sinking into. I want Rachel. And Constance, in that moment, understands that she has lost him. Not to death. Death is coming, yes, but it is not yet, but to something else. She has lost him to the thing he has chosen over her, and she must now watch him reach for it, even as his body is failing him. She sends for Rachel. Rachel comes to the sick room with her head bowed, her hands folded, her entire bearing that of a woman entering a space she has no right to occupy. She is dressed in the simple white dress of a house servant, not the finery that Jonathan has given her. She is making herself small, invisible, forgettable. She is doing everything she can to suggest that her presence here is unremarkable, even though everyone in the household understands exactly what is unremarkable about it. Constance withdraws. She does not leave the house. Instead, she takes up position in the sitting room that connects to the master bedroom, a small, elegant space where she can ostensibly rest while being available if her husband needs her. And there she sits, and there she listens, The door, to the bedroom remains closed. This is unusual. Jonathan has never been a man to close doors. The symbolic weight of closure does not appeal to him. But now the door is closed and locked, a detail that Miriam reports with barely suppressed urgency to Constance. He locked the door, Mom, from the inside. I heard the key turn. Constance does not respond. She continues her needlework. Her hands are steady. Her face is composed. But something in her has turned to stone. The door remains locked for 40 hours in that time. No one enters except Rachel. She brings water and broth and clean cloths. She comes and goes with the regularity of a servant performing her duties. But everyone in the household understands that something else is happening behind that closed door. What exactly? They cannot say. There is no sound of argument. There is no sound of anything. There is only the quiet padding of Rachel's feet, the soft opening and closing of the door, and the absolute silence of Jonathan within. The fever, Dr. Paulson explains during his evening visit, should break by morning. The bloodletting will have helped. The rest in isolation will have been beneficial. There is every reason to believe that Jonathan will recover, though he will need time to regain his strength. But Jonathan does not recover. On the third day, his breathing becomes worse. It takes on a quality that is not just labored, but desperate, as though he is drowning in air. His eyes, when they open, do not focus. He speaks constantly now, in a stream of consciousness that seems to come from somewhere deeper than thought. He speaks about the fields, about cotton, about the sound of the river, about his mother, dead for 40 years, about a woman named Sarah, which is not Constance's name, and he speaks about Rachel. Tell her, he gasps at one point. Tell her I have arranged ... But he cannot finish the sentence. His breath runs out. He falls back against the pillows. Constance, waiting in the adjacent room, hears this. She hears the half-formed confession, the attempt to communicate something important while his body is failing. And she understands, with a clarity that is almost supernatural, that her husband is trying to put something in place. Something legal. Something irrevocable. Something that will survive his death and alter the landscape of his estate. She gets up and walks to the door. She tries the handle. It is locked. She could knock. She could demand entry. She could send for the servants to break it down. But she does nothing. Instead, she returns to the sitting room and sits and waits and listens to the sound of her husband's breathing become progressively more difficult. On the fourth day, she sends for the priest. This is a significant gesture. If she is sending for the priest, then she is accepting that death is coming. She is preparing for Jonathan's final sacrament. The town, when word spreads, understands this as an acknowledgement, as an admission that the man in the locked room is not getting better. But still, no one enters the room except Rachel. The priest arrives in the late afternoon. He is a small man, thin and hunched, with the appearance of someone who has spent too long in the study and not enough time in the sun. He approaches the locked door with the kind of authority that priests carry, the unquestioned right to enter any room and speak with any person. But the door remains locked. He will not let me in, the priest reports, after much knocking and calling. Out. He says he will not receive last rites. He says he is not ready. Not ready for what? Constance asks. Her voice is still perfectly controlled, but something has fractured underneath it. Something is showing through. I do not know, madam. He would not explain. That night, Jonathan's breathing becomes a rattle. It is the sound of lungs filling. With fluid, the sound of a body beginning its final process of shutting down. The doctor, called again, can do nothing. There is no blood left to let. There is no medicine that will help. There is only time, and the certainty that time is running. Out. Rachel sits with him. This is known because the servants hear her voice sometimes, speaking low, her words inaudible to anyone outside the room. She sits with him as he dies, and no one else is permitted to be present. Not his wife of 23 years. Not his doctor. Not his priest. Only Rachel, and whatever conversations they are having in that locked room, conversations that the world will never hear. He dies at 3 in the morning on the 4th day. The doctor is called. He listens to the chest with his ear and announces that life has departed. The door is. The legal battle and the town's reaction. The will is read 7 days after Jonathan's funeral. A week of proper mourning, a week of flowers and casseroles, and the endless parade of people who come to the house to shake Constance's hand and tell her they are sorry for her loss. A week during which no one speaks directly about what everyone is thinking. A week of the most exquisite tension imaginable. The courthouse is full, not just with the usual people, the lawyers, the executors, the family members, but with half the county. Women who have no business being there find reasons to be present. Men who have never cared about property law suddenly develop an urgent interest in the particulars of estate division. The courtroom is packed so tightly that the air itself seems to have become a solid thing, pressing down on everyone present. That Constance sits in the same spot she occupied for the reading of the preliminary documents. Her dress is still black. She will wear black for the rest of her life, though no one yet understands this. Her hands are folded in her lap. She does not look at Rachel, who sits in the colored section, separate and apart, her face an impassive. Masked. Mr. Hartwell, the same lawyer who read the earlier will, stands and begins to speak. But his voice is different now. There is no hesitation. There is no shame. Instead, there is a kind of grim certainty, the voice of a man who has seen the worst that human nature has to offer and has decided that he might as well be professional. About it, the last will and testament of Jonathan Whitmore. He reads, composed by himself on September 19, 1858, just 3 days before his death. 3 days before, not months, not even weeks, 3 days. This fact sends a ripple through the courtroom. People exchange glances. Lawyers make notes. Being of sound mind, I object to that assertion, someone calls out. It is Constance's lawyer, a man named Fletcher, brought in from Atlanta specifically to challenge the will. The decedent was not of sound mind. He was under the undue influence of, you may present your argument at the appropriate time, Hartwell says calmly. Let me finish the reading. And so he reads. He reads through the bequests to Jonathan's brother and his nephews. He reads through the relatively modest sums given to longtime servants. He reads through the provisions for the maintenance of the plantation itself. And then he comes to the section that everyone is waiting for. To my wife, Constance Eleanor Whitmore, I do bequeath the sum of $10,000 to be held in trust for her lifetime, along with the use of the cottage on the east property and an allowance of $200 per month for her personal maintenance. The room erupts. It is not an outburst of noise. There is no shouting, no dramatic exclamation. Instead, it is a sound like the air being sucked out of a room. Gasps, the scraping of chairs, whispered conversations that are not quite whispered. Enough. $10,000 is more money than most people in the county will see in a lifetime. The cottage is small but respectable. The allowance is reasonable. It is, by most measures, a generous provision for a widow, but it is nothing compared to what comes next. The remainder of my estate, including the plantation house, all associated lands comprising approximately 1,200 acres, all slaves and enslaved persons thereto belonging, all investments, all securities, and all personal property not herein specifically mentioned, I do bequeath in its entirety to Rachel Carmichael, to be held in trust on her behalf by the executors of this estate until such time as she may be freed and her legal status as a free person of color established. The room does not erupt this time. Instead, it goes absolutely silent. It is the silence of people who have just heard something so fundamentally wrong, so completely contrary to the order of the world, that they cannot immediately process it. Rachel Carmichael has become, in a single moment, one of the richest people in the state of Georgia. A woman who, by law, is not a person, has been given everything that a man could give. Constance does not move. She does not react. Her face remains perfectly composed, but something behind her eyes has gone very far away, to a place where this is not happening, where the world still makes sense, where wives are not abandoned and enslaved women do not. Inherit the earth. The courtroom erupts now. Lawyers jump to their feet. Voices rise. There are shouts of impossible. Fletcher, Constance's lawyer, is standing and gesturing wildly, making arguments that everyone understands will take years to litigate. The judge, an elderly man named Whitson, who has known Jonathan Whitmore for 50 years, is banging his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order to a courtroom that is fractured along the fault lines of propriety and law. This must be contested, Fletcher shouts. The decedent was under undue influence. He was dying. His faculties were compromised. Produce your evidence, Hartwell says calmly. The evidence is the will itself. No man of sound mind. On what grounds specifically do you claim he was not of sound mind? And this is where Fletcher hits a wall, because Jonathan's doctor will testify that he was lucid until the very end, because the servants will testify that he made his wishes very clear, because the documents themselves are in Jonathan's own hand, witnessed and notarized with all the legal precision that money and planning can purchase. The will cannot be easily overturned. Everyone in the room understands this. It is horrible, and it is wrong, and it is completely, utterly legal. By the next day, the story has spread beyond Savannah. Papers in Atlanta and Charleston pick it up. Plantation owner leaves estate to enslaved woman, the headlines scream. Widow disinherited in favor of mistress, other papers suggest, seizing on the obvious conclusion about the nature of the relationship, even though the word mistress carries implications that are not quite accurate and completely impossible to defend against. The town divides. There are those who see it as proof of Jonathan's madness. Surely no sane man would make such a decision. There are those who see it as proof of some kind of conspiracy, that Rachel must have poisoned him, bewitched him, worked some kind of dark magic. There are those who see it as a betrayal of the social order itself, a transgression so fundamental that it threatens the entire structure of Southern society. And there are, quietly, those who understand what has actually happened, who see that Jonathan, at the end of his life, has made a choice that is both deeply wrong and deeply human. He has chosen the one person in his world who has nothing and given her everything. Whether this is an act of love or an act of cruelty, whether he is trying to atone or trying to destroy, is a question that will be debated for years. Constance hires more lawyers. She files motions and challenges. She argues that Rachel's legal status as an enslaved person makes her incapable of inheriting property. She argues that the will was obtained through undue influence. She argues that her husband was not of sound mind. She argues, essentially, that the entire world has gone insane and that someone should do something about it. It is a losing battle from the start, and Constance understands this. She will win small victories, slight increases in her allowance, modifications to the custody of certain properties, but she will not win the war. The fundamental architecture of Jonathan's will is sound. It is horrifying, but it is sound. The town splits into factions. There are those who support Constance, the women of her social circle, who understand that her humiliation is a threat to all of them. If a wife can be cast aside so completely, so publicly, then none of them are safe. There are those who are fascinated by Rachel, who see her as the living embodiment of a kind of revenge, a way for the voiceless to finally speak. And there is the question that no one can answer. What was in Jonathan's mind when he wrote that will? Was it love? Was it guilt? Was it an attempt to destroy his wife? Was it an attempt to challenge the entire social structure that had allowed him to do exactly as he pleased for his entire life? The most fascinating theory, the one that circulates through salons and parlors for years to come, is that Jonathan discovered he was dying and decided that his last act on earth would be to create chaos, to ensure that after he was gone, the world would remember him not as a successful planter, but as a man who broke all the rules, who lived according to his own desires, who refused, even in death, to obey the rules that had governed everyone else. If this is true, then he succeeded. Rachel does not leave the plantation. This surprises everyone. She could have fled. She could have taken her inheritance and disappeared into the north, into freedom, into a life that bears no resemblance to her past. But she stays. She remains in the house, in the quarters, in the fabric of the place that has defined her entire existence. She hires a lawyer, a progressive man from Atlanta, who believes in challenging property law and social order. Together, they work on getting her manumitted officially, converting her de facto freedom into legal reality. The process will take years, but it will happen. Rachel Carmichael will become, in the eyes of the law, a free woman. But even as a free woman, even as a landowner and a woman of means, she will never be accepted. She will never be invited to social gatherings. She will never be part of the community that surrounds her. She will be something worse than enslaved. She will be visible, undeniable, a constant affront to everyone around her. Constance, in her cottage on the East property, begins a different kind of life. She is no longer a plantation wife. She is no low. What happened to them after 20 years pass? The Civil War comes and goes, and in its aftermath, the entire social structure that Jonathan Whitmore had spent his life maintaining crumbles. The plantation system, which had seemed like the natural order of the universe, is suddenly revealed to be a construct, a fragile thing, dependent entirely on the violence and theft that underpinned it. The slaves are freed by proclamation, and suddenly, Rachel Carmichael, who was already free, already in possession of wealth that most freed people could never imagine, becomes something else entirely. A woman who had freedom before freedom was fashionable, who had property before property was legally possible for her race. She does not return to the plantation house. In the years after Jonathan's death, she had lived quietly in the quarters, had supervised the management of the estate through lawyers and overseers, had done everything possible to remain invisible despite being the visible embodiment of everything wrong with Jonathan's final decision. But after the war, after the world has changed, she moves into a smaller house in Savannah proper, in the free-colored neighborhood, in a space that is entirely her own. She never marries. She never has children. She never gives anyone the satisfaction of either accepting or rejecting her in any formal social capacity. She simply exists, a woman of means, a woman of property, a woman whose presence is a constant reminder of the ways in which the world had twisted itself into impossible shapes to accommodate the desires of men like Jonathan Whitmore. She keeps meticulous records of all her holdings. She pays her taxes. She maintains her properties with the same care that Jonathan had once expected. She becomes, over time, a kind of curiosity, the woman who inherited a fortune from a planter in a way that should not have been possible, the woman who refused to disappear or accept apologies or integrate herself into any community that would have her. She simply persists, decade after decade, existing in the cracks that the social order has left for her. People who encounter her in her later years describe her as quiet, controlled, almost eerily calm. There is no bitterness visible on her surface. There is no rage, no obvious trauma from her years in slavery, no dramatic displays of the suffering she endured. There is only a woman who has learned to occupy space without demanding anything from anyone, who has learned that the greatest revenge is not noise but silence, not destruction but persistence. She dies in 1887 at the age of 57 in a house that is entirely her own, with money in her accounts and property in her name, and the singular distinction of having been the one person in Georgia who forced the state to confront the contradiction between its laws and its morals. Her will is simple. She leaves her entire estate to a school for freed children. She leaves her house to a church. She leaves no personal effects, no jewelry, no objects that might suggest that she was anything other than what she appeared to be. A woman defined entirely by what had been given to her, not by who she was. Constance outlives her. This is perhaps the cruelest irony of all. Constance lives to the age of 84, spending the last 50 years of her life in the cottage on the east property, growing smaller and more invisible with each passing year. The town forgets her. The scandal that had seemed so enormous, so world-shattering, fades into history. Young people grow up who do not even know her name, who have never heard the story of the woman whose husband left everything to an enslaved woman. History has other concerns. The war dominates all memory. Everything else becomes small. She develops a small reputation in her final years as a woman of wisdom, a woman who has suffered greatly and endured with grace. People, particularly younger women, come to her sometimes, seeking counsel about marriages that are difficult, about husbands who are distant or cruel. And Constance listens, and she tells them nothing. She has learned over decades that there are some things that cannot be said, some truths that are too large to be spoken aloud. But there is one woman who comes to her regularly in her final years, a woman who is the granddaughter of one of the plantation workers, a woman named Sarah, who is young and unmarried and looking for a way to understand her own family's history. To Sarah, Constance speaks sometimes about what it means to be a woman in a world that is not designed for you, about the ways that control can become a prison, about the silence that can become louder than any scream. Did you love him? Sarah asks once, boldly, in a way that only a young person who has not yet learned propriety can ask. Constance is silent for a very long time. She is 92 years old at this moment, and she has just 3 months left to live, though neither of them knows this. I love the idea of him, she says finally. I love the life he could give me. I love the position. I love the perfection of it. But him, the actual man? I'm not certain I ever saw him. I only ever saw the role he was playing. And the cruelest part of it all was that he was only ever playing a role too. None of it was real. None of it was ever real. What about Rachel? Sarah asks. Rachel, Constance says, and there is something in her voice that is not quite forgiveness, but is in the neighborhood of understanding. Rachel saw him. I don't know if she loved him. I don't know if what happened between them was anything that could be called love. But she saw him. She looked at him and understood something about what he wanted, what he needed, what he was willing to destroy to have it. And in the end, that was more powerful than anything I could offer him. Control over someone who sees you is always more powerful than love from someone who is merely performing it back to you. When Constance dies in 1891, very few people come to her funeral. There are no grand eulogies. There are no stories of her great kindness or her remarkable life. She is buried in the churchyard, in a grave that faces the opposite direction from Jonathan's. as though even in death she is refusing to look at him. A cottage on the east property falls into disrepair. The money in her account goes to a distant cousin who she had not seen in 30 years. Her possessions are dispersed, sold, or given away, or simply left to rot in the abandoned house. Within a generation, no one remembers her. Within 2 generations, she is entirely forgotten, but Rachel's name persists. Not because she is celebrated. She is never celebrated, never honored, never integrated into the official history of the South, but because the will is preserved, filed away in courthouse records, a document that anyone can access and read and marvel over. She becomes a footnote in history, an anomaly, a woman whose name appears in documents about property law and the olive. Peculiar institution. She becomes a question that historians argue about, a woman whose motivations and methods and meaning are endlessly debated. The question that was asked at Jonathan's funeral: did she kill him? Did she hasten his death? Did she whisper something to him in that locked room that made him want to destroy his wife and redistribute his entire world? Is never answered. The records show nothing suspicious. The doctor found no poison. The circumstances were consistent with natural causes. But the question remains, hovering over her name forever, a shadow that she can never fully escape. In 2024, a historian named Dr. Amanda Chon publishes a book about the Whitmore case. It is called The Inherited Lie: Power, Property, and the Woman Who Broke Everything. In it, Dr. Chon argues that Rachel did not need to poison Jonathan, that he poisoned himself slowly with his own cruelty, his own hunger for something he could not obtain through legitimate means. She argues that Rachel's greatest act was not her presence in that locked room, but her refusal, afterward, to disappear. That in remaining visible, in refusing to apologize, in simply existing as a free woman with property and power, she forced the world to confront its own hypocrisy. But Dr. Chon also notes, in the margins of her analysis, that the question remains open, that there is no definitive answer, that Rachel Carmichael lived and died without ever explaining herself, without ever defending herself, without ever giving the world the satisfaction of knowing exactly what she had done, exactly what she had wanted, exactly what had transpired. In that locked room when a dying man reached out for her and turned away from his wife. Perhaps, Dr. Chon writes, this is Rachel's final victory. Not the will itself, not the property, not the freedom, but the permanent question mark that she leaves behind. The reminder that some stories do not have neat conclusions, that some women take their secrets to the grave, that there are moments in history where the record becomes ambiguous and refuses to settle into a comfortable narrative. The book is acclaimed. It wins awards. It becomes required reading in universities. Rachel Carmichael, who had been a footnote, becomes a figure of fascination and scholarly debate. Her story is told and retold, analyzed from every angle, examined, under every possible lens. But somewhere in this endless analysis, something is lost. The actual woman, the woman who was enslaved, who was given everything, who was still a woman, who had to navigate a world that did not want her to exist, disappears. Behind the historiography, she becomes a symbol, a question mark, a point of debate in seminar rooms, and perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps that is how the Whitmore story was always meant to end, not with clarity, but with endless uncertainty. Not with answers, but with questions that echo forward through time, generation after generation, forcing each new era to confront the same. In 2031, during renovations to the Savannah County Courthouse, workers discover a hidden compartment in the wall of the records room. Inside are several letters, written in Jonathan Whitmore's hand, dated in the months before his death. They are addressed to Rachel. In them, Jonathan writes about his fear of death, his fear that he will be forgotten, his fear that his life will have meant nothing. He writes about Constance, describing her with a kind of clinical detachment, as though she is a museum piece rather than a person. He writes about the impossibility of ever truly connecting with another human being, about the way that control and power had become his only vocabulary for intimacy. And in the final letter, dated just 4 days before he died, he writes this: I have made arrangements. I have written the will as we discussed. When I am gone, you will have everything. But I wonder, as I write this, whether I am giving you a gift or a curse, whether I am freeing you or binding you more completely to me than you ever were before, whether my death will finally allow you to escape, or whether it will simply ensure that you can never escape, that you will spend the rest of your life defending this inheritance, explaining these choices, bearing the weight of my final act. Do not know if I love you. I have never been certain that I know how to love anything that cannot be owned. But I know that you are the only real thing in my life. And if I cannot take you with me, I can at least leave you with everything. Whether that is an act of generosity or an act of violence, I suppose, depends on who is telling the story. Forgive me or condemn me. I will be beyond either. The letters change nothing legally, but they change something in the way the story is understood. They suggest, for the first time, that Jonathan's will was not the result of a final madness, but of a deliberate choice, that he knew exactly what he was doing, that he understood the chaos it would create. They also suggest that Rachel knew, that whatever conversation passed between them in that locked room, it was not a new conversation, that the will itself was not a surprise, that Rachel, in remaining at his bedside, was not witnessing a final confession, but the inevitable conclusion of something that had been planned for months. Whether this makes her culpable or heroic or simply human is something that each reader must decide for themselves. The letters are published in academic journals. They are quoted in updated editions of Dr. Chun's book. They generate new rounds of debate, new theories, new attempts to understand what can perhaps never be fully understood. And somewhere, in the space between the documents and the history and the endless analysis, a woman who has been dead for over a century is finally heard, not clearly, not completely, but heard nonetheless. And perhaps that, in the end, is all any of us can hope for, that our story, whatever it is, will be preserved long enough for someone to ask, again and again, what we meant, what we wanted, what we did and why, and whether we were right to do it, whether we were ever truly seen at all.